This is Dan from Ethereal Audio, and today we're talking about Ethereal Drums. Ethereal Drums is the first virtual instrument offering from Ethereal Audio, and aims to be the most comprehensive drum library available for Kontakt. Designed from the ground up to be the most customizable virtual drum solution anywhere, every sample was captured with reference microphones in a small, acoustically treated room with no compression, EQ, or processing applied. The complete dynamic range of each piece was captured using a proprietary template, resulting in over 75,000 samples taken from 10 kick drums, 10 sets of tom drums, 9 snare drums, 2 hi-hats, and 9 cymbals, consolidated to 17,000 samples by employing a feature called access control. The comprehensive approach we took allows for the very fine manipulation of the drum kit sound, making it equally well suited for heavy metal, jazz, or any genre whose dynamic and stylistic needs may fall in between. In addition to a fully featured mixing console with volume, phase, pan, EQ, compression, and transient control offered per channel, as well as per channel ADSR and tuning controls, users have the ability to manipulate the room in which the kit is placed, using over 1,000 impulse responses taken from 10 real-life acoustic spaces, as well as the ability to change the microphones that are used in the recording process with built-in microphone modeling technology. The deep potential of this approach is explored across 50 kit presets, spanning dozens of genres, and the 400 included MIDI grooves, which can be previewed from the instrument's built-in MIDI player. There's a lot of ground to cover this piece, so let's get started. "56 individual drum pieces were captured in the creation of this instrument, including some really rare and one-of-a-kind shells. I think the easiest way to walk you through them will be to just click through from the drum screen here. To select which drums are active, you click the drop-down menu on each piece. Drums can also be selected from the mixer screen, which we'll cover when we get there. So let's start with kicks. Actually, we'll do kicks and toms at the same time, because they were all part of shell packs that were captured together. Do note that you can mix and match kicks and toms. You're not locked into Yamaha custom toms if you pick the Yamaha custom kick. And in fact, many of the presets are built using mismatched sets. The kit that loads up when you first fire up Ethereal Drums is a DW Exotic Tamo Burst kit, which has a 22-inch kick. Beautifully resonant head, just a great all-around performer for any genre. The tone of any of these kicks can be dramatically shaped using the options on the mixer screen, which we'll get into later. I just want to walk you through it all the completely unprocessed pieces sound like. The toms are 16, 14, 12, and 10 inches, and have a beautifully focused tone to them. Note that you can change the tuning of any piece up or down by 5 semitones from the mixer screen, so if tuning, especially in toms, conflicts with an arrangement, you have plenty of options. Next, we sample the 16-inch Ludwig Breakbeats Kit from the Questlove Signature Shell Pack, which comes with 13 and 10-inch toms. So immediately, you can hear the difference in what a 22-inch and a 16-inch kick sound like. More thud, a little warmer, nice focus low end. Great for any kind of hip-hop production where you want to leave space for 808s or subs, or leave a little more breathing room in the low end. Going down the list, we have a 24-inch kick from a 1970s Ludwig Olive Badge kit. Deeply resonant kick, very boomy character. This is very similar to the kit that John Bonham and Led Zeppelin played. You can hear when I'm playing this one, you get a lot of sympathetic ringing from the rest of the kit. The amount of ringing is all controllable from the mix screen, which we'll get into later, but leaving it at stock setting will lend a lot of realism to your drum performances in full context. These toms, 16 and 13 inches, they almost sound like timpanis to my ears. These ring out quite a bit too, which, again, adds a lot of realism, but this is all controllable from the mix screen as well. Alright, next up we have one of my personal favorites from this collection, the Neusonic Digital Black Oyster kit. This kick is huge, 22 inches, absolutely huge sound. Toms are equally massive. I really get prog metal vibes off of these ones. Obviously, Danny Carey doesn't play this small of a kit, but flawless for you. Okay, let's keep it going. Up next, we have the Pearl Export Kit, which has a 22-inch kick, 16 and 10-inch toms. So it's worth noting that of the kits we captured, the majority, 7 out of 10 of them, are 2-tom configurations with 1 3-tom set and 2 4-tom sets. A lot of this is a product of what we had available to us, but 2 toms will get you pretty far in most musical styles. In a later video on this channel, I'll show you how to manufacture extra toms if you need them. The quick version is you can duplicate the contact instance to another channel in your DAW and up or down tune your tom depending on what you need. So this is another all-arounder, great for any kind of rock material, garage, indie, that kind of thing. You'll hear a little rattle from the snare wires on both the kick and tom here. You can really tailor how much of that you want by adjusting release values from the ADSR section, but it can actually add a lot to a driving snare rhythm. Almost functions like a built-in shaker. So next we actually have the only kick and tom combo that we captured together that wasn't purpose-built to go together. We have a 24-inch Pearl Championship Maple marching kick, and a pair of Peavey Radial 1000 floor toms at 18 and 16 inches. The Pearl Championship kick is designed, well, for marching band. You walk around and beat it with a mallet. You can also put it on the floor and play it like a normal kick drum, which is what we did. Very powerful sounding, tons of projection, because obviously it's designed to cut through a full drum line and ambient noise outdoors. So the toms aren't exactly off the shelf. Peavey only made drums for a few years, starting in 1994 and discontinued production in 2002. It's a lugless design, so the skins were held in place with self-supporting wooden rings, which meant no adjustable tension or tuning, although we can change tuning in contact, of course. They never really caught on, had durability issues. Definitely a case of a company known for one thing, trying to be disruptive and reinvent the wheel, but check this out. Absolutely massive sounding. We actually use these in a few of the Jazz Kit presets because the level of projection you get out of them once you adjust for volume is fantastic for big band style arrangements. Just as at home in a heavier genre when you want an explosive tom roll though. Next up, we have the only 3-tom kit from the 10 we sampled, a 22-inch Tama Starclassic Bubinga kick with 16, 12, and 10-inch toms. Great all-around rock sound. The sound of this specific drum kit is burned into my memory forever because of how many gigs I've played at small clubs, hunch over my keyboard with my ear about 3 feet away from them. Hey Dave, if you're watching this. Great all-around performer again. Shells are very resonant due to the thicker design of the Bubinga shells, which again can be completely controlled from the mix screen with the moon gel option once we get to it. Real Swiss Army knife, it can work for just about any genre, especially with adjustable tuning on the toms. Next, we have the other 4-tom kit from the collection, the fabled Yamaha custom recording kit. So, if you're designing a drum kit in a lab with the intent of making the cleanest possible sound that could drop right into any production, this would probably be the kit you ended up with. Reminds me a lot of Taylor acoustic guitars in that way. One of the most recorded drum kits of all time, these really took off in the 80s. Throw some reverb and hard panning on it and you'll get those instant 80s power ballad vibes. Actually, let's switch over to one of our 80s inspired kit presets to really let that shine. So these are still fantastic performers today. They're really the kind of drum where if you were running a project studio yourself and only had space for one house kit, It'd be a fantastic choice to have these on hand. They'll just never give you any grief as long as you take care of them. Rounding out the collection, we have two jazz-oriented kits. First up, we have a Sonor Vintage Series set with 22-inch kick, 16 and 13-inch on toms. Very resonant, kick rings out quite a bit. So just a reminder again, all these samples are captured in a completely deadened room, so any ring you hear is just the natural ring of the piece. The sound will be very at home in any kind of jazz trio arrangement. And finally, we have the Yamaha Bebop Birch Kit, with an 18-inch kick, 14 and 12 inches on the toms. Just going to do the same pattern here I just did with the Sonor. So you can definitely hear the size difference on the shells between the two kits. Of all the kits we captured, this is probably the one that's going to sound the way it sounds regardless of what you do, but I think that's a great thing. Not something you do a lot of, say, blast beat or metal with, but if you're a media composer, you know you always have to be versatile. And we haven't even dipped into all the ways that you can shape the sounds you've heard so far. These are just all the completely unprocessed sounds, so trust me when I say you're going to be up to your ears in versatility. Alright, so now let's get into the snare drums. We captured 9 of them, ranging a few decades of designs, models, and all kinds of sizes. First is the one you've been hearing so far, which is a Ludwig Acrolite 6.5 by 14-inch snare with a serial number that dates back to the 70s. Really gives you that quintessential balanced snare sound, takes very nicely to compression. So I'm going to go through each of the articulations real quick on snare because we got 7 for each snare. You got normal, dampened, that's hit with a muffling ring on the shell, rim shot, cross stick, flam, all flams have a standardized timing, and roll. Note that all these articulations have round robins besides snare roll, which will trigger the same roll every time for consistency's sake. Rolls also have no release note, so if you're using them, it's recommended you end them with a flam or a normal note. Next snare is a modern Acrolite, which is a smaller model at 5.5 inches depth and has a lot more of its fundamental ringing out, especially at higher velocities. So, I probably shouldn't assume everyone who is watching this knows what I'm referring to when I say fundamental. Basically, every snare drum has a pitch it's tuned to based on tension and size of the shell. The harder you hit the snare, the more this pitch rings out, which can create issues in a production if that note isn't in the same key as the production, or if you just don't want it to be there. I'll play a tone generator here to show you where the pitch is on this snare drum. So there's an option on the mix screen to reduce the fundamental level of every snare drum with a tuned impulse response, as well as the ability to physically tune the fundamental higher or lower to play nicer in the key of a given song. We decided to capture all of our snares completely undampened and let this ring out because, at the end of the day, it isn't that hard to remove troublesome ringing with some notch EQ, and we felt it's better to have the option to leave it in. If you don't want any ringing at all, of course, you can just use the dampened articulation. So once again, normal, dampened, rim shot, cross stick, flam, and roll. Next up is a Mapex Black Panther Wasp, which is a smaller snare at 5.5 by 10 inches. Very melodic quality, this one. Definitely recommend using the tuning function to bring into the key of your song if you're choosing to leave the fundamental intact. Once again, we have normal, dampened, rim shot, cross stick, flam, and roll. Next, we have the Cogs Copper Body MC63 6x14 snare, one of my personal favorites. Just has a quintessential funk sound to it. Just fantastic, especially a material that has a lot of grace notes and rolls. Articulation's normal, dampened, rim shot, cross stick, flam, and roll. Next, we have our first boutique drum, a Hoyt White Oak Custom 6.5 by 14 inch. This was made by a small producer in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. Really buffo sound, really stands out in heavy rock arrangements. Once again, normal, dampened, rim shot, cross stick, flam, and roll. Next, we have a Mapex Phat Bob, which is a 7x14 snare. This snare has a thicker maple shell design, which gives it a beautiful boominess and makes it really jump out of the mix in metal and hard rock arrangements. Articulation's normal, dampened, rim shot, cross stick, flam, and roll. Next, we got the only true Piccolo we captured this time around. I really love the sound of this one dampened or with the reduced fundamental option toggled, but we're giving you all the unprocessed sounds for now. So normal, dampened, so satisfying, rim shot, cross stick, flam, and roll. The dampened Piccolo and dampened Wasp really shine if you're going for root-style hip-hop arrangements. You get a really tight and punchy sound that almost sounds like a trap snare come to life on a real kit. One of the more rewarding parts of making this product for us was finding interesting combinations like that, because it would never be my first instinct as a recording engineer to dampen an already small drum. Next, we have our other boutique snare, and this one is a showstopper. This is the Sugar Percussion's Texas Blue Poplar snare, and my goodness. If there's one snare in this collection that rings out perfectly the way the Yamaha custom kit does and could be placed seamlessly in any genre, any arrangement, it's probably this one. There's just not a single sour frequency that rings out when you hit it. It takes tuning really well. If you actually zoom into it in a session, it almost looks like a perfect sine wave. It's just an absolutely beautiful piece. Just putting it into the universe, we would absolutely love to create a virtual instrument at some point that samples Sugar Percussion's entire line. This one was an absolute pleasure to work with. Articulations are normal, dampened. You're feeling that one in your chest if you're on headphones. Rim shot, cross stick, flam, and roll. And last but not least, by many accounts the most recorded snare drum of all time, we got the Ludwig Supraphonic. Great bloom on the fundamental, which, again, can be taken out as with every other snare. Takes compression like a champ. There's a reason it's so commonly used. Articulations are normal, dampened, rim shot, cross stick, flam, and roll. Next, we'll tackle the hats. We captured two of them. A Zildjian 15-inch custom A hi-hat, which is what you've been hearing so far, and a Zildjian 17-inch custom K hi-hat. Each hi-hat has been sampled with 7 different articulations, which are mapped to different keys, or if you're using V-drum mode, you can access them by letting up on the V-drum pedal. We have closed, pedal, pressed, loose, half open, open, and long open. . Open articulations are automatically choked by closed articulations, and you can adjust and even automate the speed by which they get choked on the mixer screen. Note that choke speeds differ a little bit at baseline on both hat models because they had to be physically modeled, and larger hi-hats just take a little bit longer to completely choke. I'm going to play the same drum groove twice and just change out the hi-hat because it's a little harder to get a feel for what a hi-hat sounds like without context from the rest of the kit. So definitely a huskier and darker tone of the 17-inch. I'd say the 15-inch is probably the one to go with in most arrangements, but the 17-inch can really shine in situations where you want a grimier kind of sound. Programming really complicated hat sequences on keyboard feels really natural with this instrument. The spacing in general MIDI mapping mode, we'll get into note mapping a little later, is really conducive to finding interesting pulses by just randomly playing different articulations, or even moving them around on the piano roll after the performance has already been recorded. Cool stuff. Finally, we got cymbals, and we recorded 9 of them. 3 recorded from the crash position, 3 recorded from the splash and china position, 3 recorded from the ride position, and all effects, china, and crash cymbals are reversible in position. 3 articulations from each cymbal were recorded, striking bell, tip, and edge. Unlike shells, these have a baked-in placement in the stereo field of the kit because we wanted to keep the stereo image of the bells consistent with the shells, regardless of how much gear we swapped out, and you also generally don't put spot microphones on cymbals when recording a full kit due to the phase issues that can cause. They can still be panned, or the stereo field of the entire kit can be reversed in the utility screen, but it's good to be aware that you're effectively panning a signal that already contains stereo information when you're panning the cymbals. So I'm going to play the bell, tip, and edge articulation of each of these in that order, just to get through them really quick. For crashes, we have the Zildjian 18-inch thin fast crash. For the rides, we have 3 more Zildjians, headquartered in my home state of Massachusetts, so maybe a little subconscious loyalty going on here. A 20-inch custom A ping ride, Every cymbal you've heard so far can be choked just like the hi-hats by playing a choke note. The speed at which this happens can be controlled in the mixer screen. Note that if you have the V-drum mode activated, chokes are actually controlled by polyphonic aftertouch messages sent by the V-drum when you physically grab the edge of the cymbal. So there you go, all 56 pieces. Now, how do we go about recording this $30,000 collection of drums? Everything was captured in a very dry, highly dampened recording room, which was purpose-built for drums, and everything was captured using reference microphones, with the exception of kick, which is captured with both a reference microphone and a sub-kick microphone. Now, why did we do it this way? Both myself and the recording engineer who did the primary recording for this product started at the same recording studio, and we share an ethos about recording drums. A clean, direct recording of a drum kit in a well-treated room will always give you more options in the mix than a kit recorded in a large, reverberant room. Recording in large rooms can lead to very inspired results, and the sound of a big kit in a big room is a characteristic drum sound of a lot of classic records. But you'd be surprised by how many larger-than-life drum sounds you can get out of a smaller kit captured in a small space. By doing things this way, we opened up the possibility to add that space in later, or even during the performance with how Lightweight Contact's DSP engine runs. By using reference microphones, we also gain the ability to simulate the frequency and transient characteristics of non-reference microphones, and add microphone emulation as an additional tonal option. Let's dive out of the eye candy screen and into the mixer screen to show you where this process really bears fruit. So, this is the mix screen, and it has all the basic features of a mixing console. Volume, panning, solo, mute, phase, EQ, transient control, and compression, which are always in that order in the effects chain. We also have some controls which will be more familiar to people who are used to working with samplers and synthesizers like ADSR. Below that, we have room and reverb sends, tuning control, and this axis knob here, which I'll explain in a bit. Above those, we have per-channel velocity controls. By the way, everything over in this section controls whichever channel is active, which you can determine by selecting your channels down here, unless you're on the room or reverb channel. Then it will control whichever channel you had last selected from the kit. Your visual indicator will be the drum picture in the top left here. A little confusing, but Kontakt unfortunately doesn't let you put effects in serial on send channels, so the reverb and room mic channels are basically the end of the line. We can't apply compression or EQ to them inside Kontakt, but we'll show you how to route everything outside of Kontakt for manipulation in another video. This middle part of the screen is for drum-specific options, which differ depending on the drum selected. The two pictures up here let you choose your drums from this screen the same way you would from the drum screen, as well as choose which microphone emulation you want to use on your drum. So let's start from the top left corner. So, as mentioned, everything in this product was recorded with reference microphones, specifically the Earthworks DK7 kit. This was done to get the fastest transient response and flattest frequency response possible, which made it easier to create emulations that dip into other microphone models. So, the way we did microphone modeling in this product was to put the microphones we modeled in the same room, same position as the reference microphones, and run a series of sine sweeps from our speakers 6 inches away from the capsules. These recordings were used as a dataset for a machine learning process, and we determined the frequency response and transient sensitivity needed to translate the reference microphones into each of the microphones we were modeling. We printed this information as a translation layer to impulse responses, and the end result, while not identical to using a different microphone, comes extremely close. Close enough to pass an A/B test, and definitely close enough for use as a tone shaping tool. So if you click this drop-down menu, anytime you have EW selected, you're running the raw, unaffected signal. If you click to any of these other options, you're running everything through a zero latency impulse response. On kick, there are 6 microphones we modeled 10 on everything else. So why don't I click through the options on kick here. So some of these, particularly the first 3, make quite a dramatic difference. That's because kick microphones have extremely exaggerated EQ curves, which tend to boost subs, give you a large dip in the low-mid range, and a steep rise in the 2 to 4K range for the beater sound. Exactly how the microphone is tuned and whether the boost works well with a beater and subs on a particular drum determines a lot of whether it's the right microphone for the job. But this can be very useful if you have a very specific drum sound you're going for, or you're using the drums as sample augmentation and want something to get you to a mix decision quicker than EQ will. I'll click over to Snare real quick to show you the microphone set that's used on every other kit piece. So, it's pretty subtle stuff, but if you come from a recording background and are familiar with the sonic characteristics of these mics, which I can't name directly for trademark reasons, but they're pretty easy to figure out, or even if you want to go through some options quickly until you get something that feels right for your arrangement, the effect of this can add up very quickly. Feel free to leave everything on Earthworks or just click through the presets over here, though. This is honestly a pretty tweaky and subtle option outside of the kick drum. We just want to leave no stone unturned. So back to kick. Directly below the drum and microphone pictures, we have the drum-specific mix area, which, as you may have noticed, will change depending on which channel is active. Let's go through what that means for each channel real quick. On kick drum, we have just 3 options. We have independent volume control over the sub-mic and beater mic signal because kick was recorded with both. So I'll show you what this sounds like, and you may not hear anything when I do this if you're listening in on phone speakers. Definitely an option to play with on nice headphones, or in a system where you really trust your subs. The subs in this instrument are pretty high by default because, hey, who doesn't like kick drums that sound like thunder? But if your drums and bass are clashing in an arrangement, this is probably the quickest place to make an adjustment first. Underneath that, we have the analog processed kick option. So, we really resisted the temptation to throttle our samples through processing in this instrument. We felt dry, highly controlled samples give the end user the most flexibility possible on how those drums will fit in their arrangement. But the kick drums on this mode have been processed in a way that would be very difficult to replicate with simple effects processing. Think of it as an instant metal button. So you'll notice when I click this that a few options go gray, the sub and beater mic levels as well as the axis control, because we're actually replacing that signal path with a completely different processed one. So actually, real quick, let's fire through what each kick drum sounds like with and without this option, because the character change essentially doubles the amount of kicks that are available in Ethereal Drums. So the DW, the breakbeats, the olive badge, the Neusonic, love that one, the Pearl export, cleans up the kit bleed quite a bit, the marching kick, almost becomes like a reggaeton kick. The Bubinga, the Yamaha Custom, Ugh, so clean. The Sonor. A little clicky on its own, but can be useful for drum augmentation if you need the click. And finally, the Bebop. That kind of stays the way it is, but it does cut back a little bit on the melodic quality of that drum. Cool, so those are the options on kick. Moving on to snare. So we have independent volume control over every articulation here, useful if you want to take down the volume of a specific articulation when you're performing, or don't feel like manually taking down the velocity. So say you want your cross sticks to hit a little quieter when you're playing on a kit. Useful option to have. Below that, we have an option called Reduce Fundamental, and this activates a gain-compensated comb filter that will remove most of the ringing from the selected snare. So let's try that. Cool. A little subtle on the vintage Acrolite because that doesn't ring much to begin with, but if we go for something with a lot of ringing like the Mapex Wasp, quite a difference. Let's try that on the Piccolo as well. Pretty dramatic, especially in the context of a mix. Do note that if you change tuning, the comb filter will not follow, so you might have a small amount of ringing that gets reintroduced when you do that. Next we get hi-hat. Same thing as before, you can control the level of all these articulations. If you're programming very complex hi-hat patterns, this can be useful for ghost notes. Again, just an extra way to give you control beyond messing with velocities in your piano roll. Down below that, we have the variable choke speed option, which lets you determine how quickly notes get choked when you go from an open articulation to a closed one. Both hi-hats have been tuned a little differently, so the 17-inch hi-hat will choke a little slower no matter what. This can be automated as well if you're programming something where you want different choke speeds in different sections. Just make sure the automation point happens before the choke occurs, not after. Cool, so next we have toms, and the active tom channels will change depending on what configuration you have open. So the DW kit has 4 toms, which means all 4 of these are active. If I change to the breakbeats, the low mid and high mid toms will gray out, because they don't exist on that kit. So for toms we have one option, but it's a good one. We created a physical modeling process that simulates what Moongel does to a tom drum. Check it out. Pretty cool. Really lets you dial in the dampening you want on toms, and each tom is independently adjustable, though I'm not really sure why you'd want one tom to be undampened when the rest are, but hey, the world is your oyster. This is really great if you have some heavy fills on toms that are ringing out and clashing with the rest of the arrangement, and you can also automate this one. It can be kind of fun to get that John Bonham Moby Dick type of tom roll. Cool. Finally, we have Ride, Crash, and China, and the options are the same on each of these. Bell, tip, and edge for articulation levels. Then we have Moongel control again, but this works a little differently here. It functions more to take out overtones and works on a basis that is individual to each kit piece. Does not affect decay time because you can control that with ADSR. This is a good option if you have a heavy buildup of cymbals in something like a metal arrangement and the frequencies are clashing with your lead guitar tone or vocals. It's another option which is best judged in context because, on its own, it won't always seem like the effect is a net gain. And finally, we can control the choke speed of each cymbal when you trigger a choke. Because chokes are achieved here by directly fading out the end of the audio, there's room for interpretation on what sounds more realistic in a given context. So if you have, say, a thrash metal or a jazz arrangement where you need more aggressive chokes, you can turn the speed up. This can also be automated, and as with hi-hat chokes, you need to automate to the setting you want prior to the choke being triggered. This is a good time to mention again that V-drum mode on the utility screen will turn on polyphonic aftertouch to trigger choke notes. So if you have a drum kit that supports that, this will let you choke notes while playing. Okay, so let's go back to Snare and take a look at the right side of the screen now from the top down. First we have our velocity controls, which allow us to reshape the velocity of incoming notes on each drum channel. So here on Snare, this curve will affect every articulation. If I move over to hi-hat, it will affect every hi-hat articulation. You have a few options for setting the curve to your taste. You can scribble directly on the curve. Fun, if a little imprecise. You can click logarithmic, linear, or exponential to get set curves, with linear being the default. So how about I play a little bit with it to demonstrate what the effect is. Basically, exponential curves will expand the dynamic range, pulling more high notes down toward the middle, where logarithmic will squeeze more notes toward the top velocities. If you want more options, you can also manipulate these knobs here. Min to create a floor, so all notes triggered are minimum velocity. Max to create a ceiling, so notes cannot exceed a maximum velocity. And curve, which will bend the incoming notes toward exponential or logarithmic modes. As with everywhere else, control-clicking these knobs will reset them to their default levels. Now, this function was primarily introduced to overcome the limitations on a lot of drum machines and other MIDI hardware. It's always best to use velocity scaling features on the hardware first. They are effectively changing the interpretation of velocities from transducers at source, whereas this will simply be reinterpreting some number that comes in between 1 and 127 and rescaling it with math. But this is a quick and easy way to get a different playing sensitivity if your hardware either doesn't have meaningful velocity scaling, or you're still getting input that's either dynamically too consistent, in the case of every note coming in triggering as 127 or close, or too inconsistent, in the case of values having too wide of a range to sound like a good drum performance. All velocity-related settings, and whether V-drum mode is on or not, can be saved as a hardware profile on the utility screen, which we'll get into a little later. It's important to know that it's not saved as part of the kit preset system. Alright, down below that we have our ADSR controls. So, ADSR stands for Attack, Decay, Sustain, Release. And if you've played around with synthesizers, you probably have a feel for what they do. For those who haven't, the primary utility of them in an acoustic drum instrument is to change the attack and release envelopes of the samples. Attack essentially controls a very small fade into the note, where release controls a fade out from the note from when you let go of the note. I'll mention why that's important in a moment. Let me show you how it sounds. Attack starts all the way to the left, and as you move to the right, you'll hear the front transient of the note get shaved off, and you'll get this pseudo brush sound on snare. We didn't capture brush articulations this time around, so if you don't have access to any of the brush sounds, you can fake it a little bit this way. For the most part, though, we'll be parking this all the way to the left, except in fringe cases where something is poking through the mix a little too much. Release is really where our bread gets buttered with drum instruments, because it lets you control the natural fade of the drum sound. So, watch what happens as I tighten up on the release of this kick and snare with this drum pattern. much, much tighter. The reason we left a lot of bleed and resonance in the recording of these kits is because this is such an effective way to manage it if you want less. It would be the equivalent of placing an edit on every hit on an isolated drum track and applying a fade in and out to taste on every hit at once. This, to me, is the beauty of working with virtual instruments. Not only can we get a performance to be perfect to whatever our definition of perfection may be, we have the ability to effect mass change on every single part of the performance with minimal effort. Fantastic stuff. So, it's worth noting here that release is dictated by when a note is released, or from a more technical perspective, when a MIDI note off message is received. This is important because if you're performing your drums on a keyboard or a drum pad, your performance may sound different on the same patch versus using an actual electronic drum kit, because you don't have the ability to hold out notes on an electronic drum kit. We'll get into the transient controller effect in a bit to show how you can dial in release without the variability of when you might light up on a note. But as a keyboard player myself, I really enjoy the ability to hold certain notes for a split second longer and release others immediately. So it's still practical to use release from ADSR as your first approach on that. Real quick on decay and sustain. If you're going to find a use for them, it's going to be primarily on cymbals or open hi-hat articulations when you're physically holding out the note. Decay represents the length of the fade from the end of the attack phase into sustain, and sustain is the level the sample is held at after decay and before the note is released. The utility of either on a drum instrument, when you're primarily focused on striking the note without holding it out, is fairly limited unless you're doing some extensive piano roll editing. So moving down, we have our reverb, room, axis, and tune section. I'll go over tuning first. Basically, every sample in the instrument can be pulled up or down by 5 semitones. This will sound pretty wonky toward the extremes, but as long as you're keeping it within a semitone or two, it can be really helpful to pull a kick, snare, or tom drum closer to the key of the music. Toms are where I'd say it's most useful. The middle two knobs, reverb and room, control the send level of the selected channel to the room and reverb aux channels over here. I'll be explaining that, as well as why we have two types of reverb channels in a little bit. Important to note, these are labeled 0 to 100%, but they're not actually making the signal 100% wet. It's just indicating that 100% of the signal is fed to both wet and dry. If you want a channel that's all wet and no dry, not really sure why you would, you can mute the channel down here and keep the sends up. A little confusing, but we found the decibel readout to be more confusing given the space restrictions. Finally, we have the axis knob. So, beside the ride crash in China, every channel has an axis control, which is an equal power crossfade between the direct microphone that was used to record that drum sample and the sum of every microphone that was off-axis at the time of capture. By moving this knob to the right, we increase the amount of off-axis signal. Left increases the level of the on-axis signal. In center position, control clicking to reset, gives the natural balance of the kit as it was recorded. I'll demonstrate what the effect of that is real quick. So, as you can hear, you get a lot more ambience as you turn it to the right, more wire sound from the snare, similar to what you get if you have a top and bottom snare mic and turn up the bottom. Turning it to the left collapses the stereo image of the signal a bit and gives you more of a direct, hoofy for lack of a better term, sound. The exact change in sound you'll get will vary a bit from piece to piece, and the effect will be a little bit different on hat, toms, and kick, but generally speaking, to the right, roomier, to the left, more direct and mono. Middle position is the natural bounce of the kit as it was when it was fully mic'd. This is all gain compensated, or close enough to it, so you can pick your tone without too much cognitive bias from it getting louder. This little trick was our way of consolidating the roughly 70 gigabytes of raw recording information down into 5 gigabytes of samples once it was encoded into Kontact's NCW lossless compression scheme. Hard drive space and even RAM aren't quite as big of a deal with virtual libraries as they used to be, but the other effect is, we don't have to offer a bleed matrix. I personally hate bleed matrices, and all the tonal options of a bleed matrix and a drum plugin have been reduced to one knob in ours, so you're welcome for that. So yeah, don't sleep on this control. You can really reshape the sound of your kit by messing with nothing besides this one knob. So below that, real quick, we have our effects chain. To access each screen, you just click Equalizer, Transient, or Comp. These are per channel, and like I said before, they arrange in the order they're placed on the signal chain. All three have a middle button that will bypass that part of the chain when you click it, or reset every value to default on that channel when you control-click it. Good for sanity checks. The EQ is your standard SSL-style 4-band EQ, with all 4 bands sweepable, adjustable Q in the mids, shelf or bell options on low and high. The transient controller is next in chain, and it comes with input, output, attack, and sustain. You can do some fun things with this one, like you can exaggerate the transient on a drum so it pokes through the mix some more, or less. Sustain will give you the ability to control the release curve as you were able to with the release function in the ADSR section, but this time it'll have the same effect regardless of how long you hold a note out for. So a better option if you're primarily using a drum kit for input, or something else which immediately sends a note off message after you play the note. Exaggerating sustain, especially on snare, can lead to some really interesting results, especially if you compress it afterward. Kind of a trashy sound, I really like it. And finally, we have the compressor, which is also SSL style. Now, note that this one is off by default. Honestly, the way the readout is scaled for normal usage was a little confusing, so we toggled it to bypass on default settings. At the detent threshold position, it triggers pretty aggressively on just about everything. There's also no way we could find of integrating gain reduction readout directly from Kontakt, so if you mess with this, you're going to have to mess with it by ear. I recommend using it primarily in parallel anyway, and as a matter of fact, let's mess with exaggerating sustain on the snare and getting a nice classic thrash compression sound. Yeah, so something for more advanced users. Left to right, the controls are threshold, attack, release, ratio, your wet-dry mix, and output gain. So onto the last two channels we haven't looked at. Let's start with the reverb screen, and you'll notice as we click there, the picture of the snare drum stayed docked up top. Everything we just looked at to the right over here is still controlling whatever the last selected drum channel was, and we can figure out how much snare we want to send to the reverb channel that way. As a matter of fact, how about we just solo it? Soloing this, and especially the room channel, are good ways to figure out what the balance of your sends sound like without any of the dry signal active. So, top to bottom on this one, pre-delay determines how much of a lag time there is between the dry signal and the wet signal. A larger pre-delay will create the impression of a larger space, but the delay can get a little distracting if it's not in time with your song's tempo. Size determines the size of the space, of course. So, anything from being outdoors to being in a gymnasium. Color simulates the surface of the reverb space. Lower values simulate softer surfaces, higher values simulate harder ones. You can hear this one a lot more in longer reverb settings, but it's pretty subtle. Damping controls the tonal quality of the reverb, with higher values sounding more muffled. And finally, stereo spread sets the amount of stereo image in the space, with lower values being closer to the sound and higher values being further away. Okay, that's a reverb. On to the more exciting stuff. So the room mic channel. This was the primary reason for the design decision to track everything in a small, acoustically controlled room. Without multiple clashing reverb signals, you can convincingly place a drum kit in a real space using impulse responses. We end up sampling 10 spaces from various distances, and interpolate that information to 126 positions per room. So, just to show you what the spaces sound like and how that works, let me play a full drum groove. Okay, so we have every channel feeding 100% signal to the room channel, and we have the room channel soloed. So let's click through the room settings real quick. Cool. So that gives you a baseline of what each room sounds like. Now let's move the room mic around. So, unfortunately, there's a small dropout that occurs in contact when an impulse response is loaded. Happens in any impulse response loader, actually, because of the way they affect the audio. But you can actually physically hear the microphone getting closer to the kit as you pull it closer. Once you get a sound you like, you can apply pre-delay, high-pass, or low-pass filters before. But you can also adjust the size of the room using Kontact's built-in DSP for doing so. So, say we like the sound of tight studio, want the space to feel bigger. Or smaller. Perfect. Now let's bring the dry signal back in and balance it. And there you go. I would further mess with the levels of signal going in, but that effectively sounds like a drum kit that was recorded in a live room. So the tonal possibilities of this are wild, and a lot of the 50 presets that come with Ethereal Drums are driven by inspiration from this feature. The room plays such a huge role in the sound of any instrument recording on any record, but particularly drums because they're so loud and so audibly excite room nodes. Having the ability to shape that character to the needs of your arrangement is an amazingly useful tool in the right hands. Speaking of presets, that ties up everything on the mix screen. You can click through presets by using the arrows here, or you can save and load your own presets by clicking these floppy disk icons. When you save or load a preset, you are saving the drums that are active, all the mix settings, all the microphones, basically everything beside velocity curves, which are saved in the utility screen as a hardware profile, and MIDI mapping, which will be the next screen we look at. Onto mapping. Any articulation in Ethereal Drums can be triggered by any MIDI note, and there are 5 default mappings which cover the most common mapping schemes that already exist. The default one is general MIDI mapping, which roughly follows the general MIDI percussion key map that has been the standard for 40 years. It's not a perfect one-to-one match because there are a few articulations we have here that don't have counterparts on the official list, but things like kick, snare, hi-hats, and toms are all in the same place. Next we get superior drummer mapping. Note that there are multiple mappings for superior drummer out there because different libraries for that platform offer different articulations, so this is the closest to a consensus we could find. You'll notice the drumstick articulation is lit up red here. That's because superior drummer doesn't have a key map for drumsticks clicking together. Anytime an articulation is highlighted in red, it means it's not currently mapped. Next, we have addictive drums, which doesn't have snare rolls and a few 3-zone cymbal articulations. Then big friendly drums, and finally V-drums, which doesn't have much of anything. When you toggle V-drum mapping, V-drum mode is automatically toggled on the utility screen, which makes the active hi-hat articulation selectable by MIDI CC, set either to your mod wheel on keyboard or by the hi-hat pedal on your V-drum kit. I'll demonstrate that with the mod wheel. So, the higher the value, the more closed the hi-hat articulation. Cymbal chokes are also handled differently. Instead of a mapped note, they're handled by a specialized MIDI message sent by the V-drum called polyphonic aftertouch. Be aware that not every DAW has full support for receiving these messages, so there may be some times where it doesn't fire if you're relying on it. So, to customize any of these mappings or to set your own, you simply select the articulation you want to map and click Edit, click or play the note you want it to be mapped to, or remove mapping if the key is already red, click Commit, and that's it. Your mapping will automatically go to user mode up top, and you can save it from there. If any articulation is no longer mapped after you've created a new mapping, it'll light up red. Note that when you save, the status of V-drum mode, if it's currently toggled on, will be saved along with your new mapping. Easy as that. Next, we have the MIDI screen. So, Ethereal Drums comes with 400 unique MIDI grooves from a wide array of genres, and you can preview them from directly inside the instrument. They will automatically sync to the tempo in your DAW and start at the top of a bar line if your session transport's running, so you can easily audition parts. Just click through the genre, groove type, and double-click the groove you want to audition. That will activate it in the top right corner in the MIDI player. To play, press the play button in the top right corner. And click again to stop. If you like what you hear, simply drag the text in the gray bar out to the drum track in your session. Even if you aren't using them for your composition, these grooves can be a fantastic way to audition different kit presets before you choose a sound for your arrangement. And honestly, if you never touch the deeper options in this product and all you do is drag these MIDI files out to your session and run them through kit presets, that is a completely valid way to use the instrument. Not everyone wants to spend half the time you'd spend setting up a real kit to dial in the perfect virtual one. Relax, we've done most of the work for you. And finally, we have the utility screen. This contains all the odds and ends we couldn't fit elsewhere in the user interface. Right up top, we have the save load options for your velocity curve profiles. To repeat from earlier, this lets you set custom velocity curves that feel right for each piece of hardware you might be using to input MIDI. Between that and custom mapping, there's a lot of flexibility in customizing the way you interact with Ethereal Drums. Below that, we have a few options. First up is perspective, which allows you to flip the stereo field of the kit from drummer's perspective, which is the default, to audience perspective. This will flip any panning that you may have on the kit, and reposition ride cymbal and splash cymbal from right to left, crash from left to right. Next, we have the width button, which toggles between stereo output for the instrument and mono. Certain genres, especially hip-hop, may sound a little more focused on drums if the signal is just monoed out, so this is a quick way to do it. And then we have the limiter, which is toggled on by default to catch peaks. Depending on the preset, this value may be a little higher or lower, but most kits are sitting at 6 decibels of gain on the limiter. The limiter doesn't really get activated unless there's a heavy fill going on, so it's really just there to catch peaks. If you want to toggle it off to have the maximum dynamic range possible coming out, for example if you're using multiple outputs from Kontakt, you just press the on-off switch. Okay, under that we have the output routing section. This is the section you'll need to set up in order to get stems out of Ethereal Drums, if you want to mix your drum channels outside of Kontakt and inside your DAW, or if you just want stems to future-proof your work. So, unfortunately this is a little too broad of a subject to get into in this video because the instructions on how you would set this up change depending on the DAW you're using. The Ethereal Drums manual has a detailed write-up. I'll try to link a video here for Pro Tools and Reaper specific directions. While you're completely aces using nothing beside Kontakt to do all your mixing, I would strongly consider mixing things out to stem for a number of reasons if you're able to. Finally, below that, we have the mode section. So, blast beat mode is toggled off by default, but turning it on essentially pulls EQ match round robins from the 12 hardest hits from every kick drum above velocity 95. This will result in a slight decrease in strike consistency because we're essentially randomizing hits for each drum instead of keeping them at the original strike intensities, but this will make a difference if you're specifically programming blast beats for metal, or any genre where you're doing anything faster than a 16th note on kick. It'll cut down on the typewriter effect which occurs when you're hitting the same note at the same velocity over and over because what essentially happens is you're playing the exact same sound files in sequence over and over again. So here it is without. And with. So it's a fairly subtle thing, and you may actually want that uber consistency without it for something like progressive metal, but in genres where you're really doing fast runs like this and want a little added realism, it makes a difference. Next, we have V-Drum mode, which, as discussed before, makes the product accept MIDI input in a way that's consistent with the Roland V-Drum series. MIDI CC 1 and 4 on the input channel will control which hi-hat articulations are played, and polyphonic aftertouch from the V-Drum kit will determine cymbal chokes. If you want to set mapping to be consistent with the stock mapping on the V-Drum series, go to the mapping screen and change it there, and this will automatically change with it. And finally, we have cymbal roll mode. So, cymbal rolls automatically occur when you play notes from the same cymbal in fast enough succession. And I think that already works fantastic, but it was tuned against recordings of professional drummers executing rolls to find the speed at which a roll starts to occur, which is pretty fast. If you want rolls to occur at slower speeds, you can click this to manual and either automate or link the slider to a CC value. This will let you control the attack value of every cymbal at once. Just as with choke speed sliders from earlier, whatever value this is set to at the beginning of a hit is the value which affects the level of the fade on that hit. Adjusting it after a note is already active won't have any effect on that note. And wow, that about covers it. If you stuck around to hear me talk for this long and I didn't put you to sleep, congratulations. This product was a massive undertaking. Took over a year of research and development, and we're very proud of what we came up with and so thrilled to finally release it. So for me and the rest of the team at Ethereal Audio, thank you so much for your support. Head over to etherealaudio.com if you want it, and have a great day.